He ripped my dress on my own street in broad daylight, said a line like he practiced it in the mirror and smiled while my neighbors watched like it was a matinee. Yeah, that happened. And in that instant, the pretty quiet town I had moved to 3 days earlier cracked open and showed me what it was made of. I was still new, still learning which way the wind came off the elm trees and which cashier at the gourmet market double-bagged bottles without being asked. My red silk dress felt like a small celebration for a life that might finally be gentle. And then a cruiser rolled beside me, windows down. 2 officers inside one, smirking, one pretending not to, and the bigger one leaned on the door like the sidewalk belonged to him and said, "A pretty thing like you in a dress like that, you must be looking for attention." And I felt his eyes crawl over me before his hand grabbed my arm hard, the kind of grip that's supposed to teach you where you rank. I said, calm as a scalpel, "Take your hand off me." He laughed, asked if I was going to call the police, and then he tore the neckline with a single yank that sounded like paper screaming. Groceries hit the pavement. A bottle shattered and bled into the curb. People paused, but no one stepped forward. You know what I mean? That polite freeze that pretends it's not fear. And the officer Miller puffed himself up like humiliation made him taller, while his partner Reed chuckled like a studio audience. The ride to the station was short and ugly cuffs too tight, their laughter filling the car while they told dispatch the story they've told 100 times. Belligerent woman, maybe high, maybe indecent, definitely resisting neat little words stacked like bricks around a version of me I didn't recognize. I kept my mouth shut because there's a time to argue and a time to observe. And when the stakes are your dignity and your freedom, the most dangerous thing you can do is give them your voice before you've gathered your facts. Booking smelled like disinfectant and old coffee, the kind of scent that tries to erase what happened here yesterday. I was paraded past bored faces and a bulletin board full of awards for community partnership. And when I asked for my phone call, Miller smiled and told me I was on their time, not mine, a line he must have loved using on people who had fewer friends than he did. And then the chief arrived, shoes too polished for this building haircut, like a campaign ad voice that never needed to rise to be heard. Chief Evans looked at me like a biologist, looks at a specimen and said, "The thing men like him always say when they're about to sell you a tidy ending, we value order here. We can make this go away, if you're reasonable. Plead to disorderly conduct, pay a fine, sleep it off, leave town tomorrow, or we can do it the hard way. Paperwork that disappears, witnesses who suddenly remember hearings that move slower than winter. Some fights are unwinnable," he said, the corners of his mouth soft with fake concern, and I stared at the camera in the corner and the one that wasn't in the corner and realized he thought he'd closed every door when really he'd just shown me where the hinges were. I should tell you something about me. The chief didn't know the thing Officer Miller didn't bargain for when he decided to rip silk off a stranger and call it law. I am not just a woman in a red dress trying to start over in a quiet neighborhood. I'm also the kind of person who has been trained to notice which hallway hums louder because there's a server rack behind the wall who can open common locks with a hairpin and a breath, who has filed away 100 different ways men like Miller justify hurting whoever doesn't fit their idea of home. I was on leave from the kind of job you don't brag about at barbecues. I wanted to rest. I wanted to be ordinary, but ordinary was over. The second his hand tore fabric, shift change came. The fluorescent buzz shifted a young officer with tired eyes and a name tag that read, Davis walked past my cell with a tray and the practiced indifference of someone trying not to drown in their own conscience. Our fingers brushed when he slid the food through the slot and a tiny folded note landed in my palm. Like a bird that knew exactly where to perch, I waited. I listened. I counted footsteps. Then I read it under the bunk lip. They do this all the time. Camera in the rear. Evidence hallway loops. 202, 10 a.m. Old janitor closet has a landline and a name with a number. Ben Carter, journalist. The kind of lifeline you don't get if the whole station is rotten to the bone, which told me something important rot is real. But so are the people inside who still want to sleep at night. Midnight crawled. I pretended to cry until my throat hurt, not because I wanted pity, but because men like Miller get noisy when they think they've won. He came to the bars with Reed and bragged like corruption was a fishing story. Quotas dressed up as community improvement, a foreman framed because he didn't pay the courtesy fee. Kids on the poor side of town tuned up in interrogation. For respect, Evans has the county in his pocket, judges, politicians, donors, he said, and I kept my face small and recorded every word with the little button they missed during intake. Because people who invent their own rules stop believing anyone else could be meticulous. That recorder clung to torn silk and drank in every confession, like it was thirsty. At 1:55 a.m., 55, the station settled into that special kind of quiet where a building thinks it's asleep. The camera light by the evidence hall blinked steady. The hairpin was in my hand. The lock was the kind a board manufacturer makes on a Monday, and the door gave me a soft click, like an apology. I moved low, slow, breathing through squeaks, counting tiles. The janitor closet smelled like bleach and dust and time. The landline sat there, beige and patient. I dialed the reporter. 2 rings, a rough voice. Carter. I told him my name, what happened, where I was, what I had, the loop, the note, the tape, and I gave him a rendezvous at an all-night diner, because Hope needs coordinates. He said he'd been chasing Evans for months and couldn't get a soul to talk on the record. I said I wasn't a soul he could put on camera, but I was a voice with facts and a recorder that didn't lie. We hung up, and then I dialed a different number I'd memorized years ago, an encrypted line to my handler, the man who had seen me in more dangerous rooms than this Peterson. He answered, and for a heartbeat I let myself believe my old world would reach in and pull me up by the collar. I reported my position requested. Quiet extraction, nothing flashy, and the silence on the other end thickened until it sounded like a door closing. I spoke to a Chief Evans. He said, cool, careful. He tells me you're stirring up trouble while on leave. We have no operational interest in Oak Creek. Handle it yourself and do not reveal your affiliation. The line clicked dead, and there it was. The twist. The moment you realize the safety net you counted on was never built for people like you. Not when your pain threatens someone else's comfort. Not when calling you a problem keeps the budget tidy. Betrayal doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks in memos and careful tones. Sometimes it tells you to stand down so it doesn't have to stand up. I locked myself back in the cell before the guard returned. I sat on concrete and let the cold burn my skin awake, and I made a decision. No cavalry, fine. I'll be my own cavalry. But this wouldn't be vengeance in an alley. It would be daylight and paper, and the kind of justice that doesn't leave bruises. You can photograph but leaves records you can't erase. Morning came thin and gray. I cried when I needed to keep Miller talking. I saved courage for the minutes that counted, and when Officer Davis walked past on late shift, I stood at the bars and said quiet like a vow. Tonight, West Sallyport maintenance door. Can you make noise in the evidence locker around midnight? He looked like a man peeling himself off a wall and nodded so slightly you'd miss it unless you were starving for hope at 11:50. The alarm screamed, doors banged, radios hiccuped. The maintenance door swung open to humid air and the kind of freedom that smells like exhaust and wet concrete. I ran barefoot, dress torn a little wild but running toward not from. The diner was lit like a fish tank. Ben sat in a corner booth pretending to read a paper, eyes taking in every entrance. I slipped into the seat opposite like a rumor slid him. The recorder watched his face process what it meant. This wasn't gossip. It was evidence that could cut down a tree, he said. This could bring the whole department down, I said. If we do it right, it can bring the whole machine down. He gave me a burner phone, said his apartment was a wreck but safe, and we hustled up 4 flights of stairs that complained with each step. His walls were covered in maps of a corruption he hadn't been able to prove. Red string crossing names that thought they were untouchable. He copied the audio, encrypted. It sent it to editors with the kind of urgency you only feel when you know the truth might not have a second chance. I stood by the window staring at a town that was about to meet itself in the mirror and dialed one more number. Dad, I said, and a part of me I don't usually share cracked open Jonathan Vance, federal prosecutor, my father, man whose voice can turn a courtroom into a quiet church. He asked if I was safe, asked for the facts like he was building a case while I was still speaking. I told him everything, including the part where my own handler told me to disappear. And I heard a storm gather in the way he inhaled. He said, "Stay put, do not move, I'm coming and I'm not coming alone." Then he added the kind of line that changes time. At 0600 we take their house, not just their door. Dawn broke with the thrum of helicopters and the crisscross of unmarked SUVs turning cul-de-sacs into chessboards. Federal agents in gear moved with the precision of people who have executed warrants on men who thought they were kings. The precinct doors didn't so much open as decide. They were done cooperating with their previous owners. Officers who had practiced being predators met a different kind of authority and went limp. Evans was pulled from a home that looked like a magazine spread and cuffed in silk pajamas. Someone handed him a stack of paper with my father's name on the warrant, and I like to imagine he finally understood that soft threats and tidy deals don't work on people who have already lost what was supposed to keep them obedient. At the same time, a quiet team walked into an office far away with an indictment for a director who thought looking away was leadership. I didn't need to watch any of that to know it happened. I've seen what it looks like when a machine meets a bigger machine with ethics for gears. What I did see was my father walk into a parking lot where Officer Miller tried to say the magic words, "I'm a police officer," and my father, hands in his coat pockets, said, calm and devastating, "Not today." Then he told him who I was and what he'd done, not because my name should matter more than any other, but because bullies only recognize scale. He wanted Miller to look around and see real authority, and understand the badge on his chest had never been a crown, it had been a responsibility he failed at miserably. The aftermath wasn't fireworks and victory speeches, it was phones ringing off the hook, people finally daring to say me too. Here's what they did to my son. Here's what happened at my shop. Here's the night they made me sign a paper I wasn't allowed to read. A tip line, lit up files were seized, servers, imaged cases reopened. Officer Davis was placed somewhere safe and told that courage doesn't always look like a movie. Sometimes it's a quiet nod and an alarm at 11:50. Ben's story ran front page with audio that made the country sit up. The part where Miller bragged about keeping order played over and over until the word order sounded like what it had always meant. Their control without consent. Evans flipped when he realized the mountain of evidence had no comfortable path over it. He named names, some of them in robes, some of them in suits, some of them in golf polos. Reed pled. Miller went to trial, like arrogance could cross, examined facts. The jury didn't take long. The judge said words like maximum and abuse of power and violation under color of law, and all I felt wasn't triumph, it was relief so heavy I slept for 12 hours and woke up thirsty. Weeks later, I stood on my father's balcony looking over a city that pretends its monuments are promises and said, "They tore my dress," he said. "It's evidence now, and I understood that sometimes what gets ripped away becomes the exact thing you hold up to the light when someone says, 'Prove it,' the seam is still there." I kept the dress. I wear it sometimes, not because I like pain, but because I like truth. The stitch runs from shoulder to waist, like a timeline, a visible reminder that what tried to break me ended up marking itself instead. People ask me if Harbor Creek, that perfect little place with leaf blowers and lake views, is fixed. No towns aren't light switches. They're gardens. They're chores. Someone always has to pull weeds, and someone always has to say that plant right there with the pretty flowers is actually strangling the ones that feed us. A new interim. Chief introduced herself by her first name and sat in living rooms and listened without a watch on committees formed. Not the fake kind with catered muffins, the kind where people argue and stay anyway. Some neighbors still cross the street when they see me, because guilt is allergic to eye contact. Some bring pies. Both things can be true if you want a moral. Here's mine. Do not rely on the machine that hurt you to fix itself just because you asked. Nicely. Bring light. Bring tape. Bring witnesses. Bring patience, like a weapon. And when the chance to help someone inside the machine shows up like Davis, with a folded note, take it. Make room for the small braveries. They're the hinges the big doors swing on. And now I'll hand it to you, because this is the part of the story nobody can tell for you where the feds too much or exactly enough does a dawn raid feel like justice or overreach. Would you have stepped onto that sidewalk when you saw a cop rip a woman's dress, called 911, walked away because the ice cream was melting, and you convinced yourself it wasn't your fight? Be honest. Not performatively brave. Honest. Have you been? Officer Davis stuck between a paycheck and a conscience. Have you been a neighbor behind a curtain? Have you been someone who thought order meant safety until you learned who had to pay for it? Tell me in the comments what justice looks like where you live. Tell me where the line is between authority and abuse. Tell me what you teach your kids to do when the person with the badge is the person who's wrong. And if this story made you mad or hopeful or both, share it, subscribe, if you want more of this. If you want the messy truth told by someone who refused to be the quiet, forgettable version of the report. I'm Maya. I moved to a place that promised peace. A man tore my dress, and the machine that protected him learned what happens when a woman decides her voice isn't a favor. It's evidence.